Doug Jones, the Democratic candidate for Senate in Alabama, campaigned with former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr. in Birmingham last month. Brynn AndersonAssociated Press. At first glance, Doug Jones, the Democratic nominee for Senate in Alabama, appears to be running a lonely race against Roy S. Moore, the arch-conservative, the former judge whose candidacy is being swallowed by accusations that he usually assaulted teenage girls. National Democratic groups have not spent a dollar on their own television or radio commercials promoting Mr. Jones, a former federal prosecutor. The party's most popular campaigners, such as former President Barack Obama and Senator Bernie Sanders, independent of Vermont, have not set foot in the state. As Republicans in Washington pressure Mr. Moore to leave the race, Democratic leaders convey a stark public message to Mr. Jones: "You're on your own, it's an Alabama race." Senator Chuck Schumer of New York, the Democratic leader, said at a news conference on Monday, repeating the phrase 3 times for emphasis. But the National Democrats' ostensibly arm's-length treatment of Mr. Jones belies a far deeper investment in the race. Senate Democrats covet Alabama's Senate seat passionately, but, as Mr. Schumer demonstrated, they are acutely aware of the risk of being seen as orchestrating the race from afar. As Mr. Jones has gained ground against Mr. Moore, Democrats have taken measured steps to shore up his candidacy, helping Mr. Jones raise money and battering Republicans who have been slow to denounce their party's embattled nominee. Several liberal activist groups have begun deploying organizers to Alabama to help prepare get-out-the-vote efforts for Mr. Jones in the December 12 election. And far from being shunned by the party, Mr. Jones' top advisors have been open about which direction the shunning is going. "Stay home, this is our race and well decided here," said Giles Perkins, a former Alabama Democratic Party chairman and one of Mr. Jones' strategists. Mr. Jones, 63, has leaned heavily on his biography and legal record in the race, highlighting above all his role in prosecuting 2 of the Ku Klux Klan members who bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham in 1963. With an easy personal manner that contrasts sharply with Mr. Moore's fire and brimstone style, Mr. Jones appealed to national Democrats early on as the kind of candidate who could win over unsettled voters to the right of center. Mr. Jones also has a political network of his own to draw on in the race, and the few outsiders to stump for him have been personal acquaintances. Representative John Lewis of Georgia, a civil rights legend who got to know Mr. Jones as a United States attorney, campaigned for him earlier this month. Former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr. rallied Democrats in Birmingham for Mr. Jones in October. Mr. Jones led Mr. Biden's 1988 presidential campaign in Alabama. Former Representative Parker Griffith, a conservative Democrat, said he spoke to Mr. Jones over the last few days and found him quiet and circumspect about the impact of the Moore scandal. He said, "Well, let's see how this plays out." Mr. Griffith, who briefly became a Republican during the 2010 campaign, said Mr. Jones was still struggling against Alabama's intense suspicion of the Democratic label. He said even bringing in Mr. Biden may have been a mistake. "The Democratic brand, in Alabama, is poisonous," Mr. Griffith said, adding, "Some of us said, my God, when you see Biden, you see Obama." For now, most Democratic leaders are happy to stay out. For all his public caution, Mr. Schumer has been effusive about the Alabama campaign in private, according to people who have spoken with him. Mr. Schumer has told allies he believes the race is now clearly winnable for Mr. Jones, but that Democrats must take pains not to nationalize the contest in a way that might offend voters in a deeply conservative state. Still, in front of reporters, Mr. Schumer could not contain his excitement this week about the prospect of snatching away a Senate seat in one of the country's reddest states. He gushed about Mr. Jones' financial dominance over Mr. Moore, who has struggled to rally Republican donors. "The amount of money that's come in, even before the Moore scandal, is enormous," Mr. Schumer exclaimed. If the Republican Party's national reputation appears to hinge on the fate of Mr. Moore's candidacy, the stakes in Alabama have grown nearly as high for Democrats. Democrats face forbidding Senate races in 2018, when they must defend several seats in Republican states and pick up 3 seats to win a majority in the chamber. At the moment, Democrats appear to have a good chance of winning only 2 Republican-held seats, in Nevada and Arizona. An upset in Alabama would change that, transforming the challenge of winning a Senate majority from a seemingly impossible task into merely an extremely difficult one. Mr. Jones' campaign seems to recognize the stakes. Flush with optimism, the Democrat has turned to a hold-the-ball approach since a number of women emerged to recount their experiences with Mr. Moore when they were teens. Mr. Jones decided not to travel to Washington on Tuesday night for a $500 per person cocktail party fundraiser headlined by such Democratic luminaries as Senator Kamala Harris and Eric H. Holder Jr., the former Attorney General, because he saw no reason to do anything that could let Republicans redirect the focus of the campaign from Mr. Moore. Instead, Mr. Jones released campaign commercials featuring voters who said they were Republicans supporting his candidacy. One video implored Alabamians don't vote for the party. Vote for the man. I'm a Republican for Doug Jones. GOP for Jones. AlsonPic.Twitter.com. Zan 7. Doug Jones at Good Douglas Hones. November 14, 2017. A powerful endorsement from Steve Duncan. Thank you, Steve. I won't let you down. Olson, right side of history. Pic.Twitter.com. and 35 Muiddles. Doug Jones at Good Douglas Hones. November 14, 2017. And discussions among Democrats about bringing in former President Bill Clinton, who has his own history with UAL impropriety, have been shelved as part of Mr. Jones' attempt to keep a local focus for the duration of the campaign. Mr. Jones, however, has benefited for months from an unheralded campaign by Democrats in Washington to direct money to his campaign, fueling his strong advantage on television. Mr. Jones has aired nearly $2 million in commercials, compared with about $300,000 for Mr. Moore. Earlier this month, Representative Terry Sewell, the only Democrat in Alabama's federal delegation, hosted a fundraising event for Mr. Jones at a townhouse that is home to the Congressional Black Caucus Institute, with Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland, the chairman of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, in attendance. Last weekend, as Mr. Moore fought for his political survival, the Human Rights Campaign, a national gay rights group, held a Mimosas with a Purpose fundraiser for Mr. Jones at a private home in Washington. State Representative Anthony Daniels, the Democratic leader in the Alabama House of Representatives, urged Mr. Jones to communicate an affirmative message about policy, rather than focusing on Mr. Moore's alleged predation. The best thing we can do is keep it positive and talk about where Doug stands, and where he is on the issues, and not get down in the mud, Mr. Daniels said. Beyond the plain value of winning the Senate seat, Democrats also sense a larger symbolic test in Alabama. Should Mr. Jones prove unable to defeat Mr. Moore, it would be a stark verdict on his party's limitations in the Deep South. Democrats have not won a major statewide election in Alabama since 2006, or elected one of their own to the Senate in a quarter-century. But Democrats believe the Moore scandal may have opened an unusually wide path to victory in a state that is typically polarized along racial lines. Mr. Perkins said many white voters would be newly willing to consider Mr. Jones. If not, Mr. Perkins said, some folks just aren't going to show up.